In this episode, we're going to learn how to design security architecture that you can defend with clear reasoning, meaning you can explain why controls exist, how they work together, and what threats they are meant to reduce. Beginners sometimes think architecture is just a diagram of networks and systems, but defensible architecture is really a way of thinking. It is the practice of starting with realistic threats, then choosing layers of controls that reduce the chance of success, reduce the impact if something succeeds, and increase your ability to detect and respond. The reason this matters for security operations management is that you are often asked to justify decisions, not just make them. If you cannot explain why a control was chosen and what problem it solves, the security program becomes a pile of disconnected tools and rules. By the end, you should be able to describe a threat-to-control mapping mindset that produces layered defenses that make sense, can be measured, and can be improved over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with the idea that threats are not abstract monsters. They are specific kinds of failures and adversary behaviors that lead to harm. A threat might be credential theft, abuse of overly broad access, exploitation of unpatched systems, or data exposure through misconfiguration. To map threats to controls, you first need to name the threat in a way that implies what the attacker is trying to do. That naming step is important because vague labels like hackers or cyber attacks do not tell you what to defend against. When you name a threat as unauthorized access through stolen credentials, you immediately start thinking about identity protections, access boundaries, and monitoring. When you name a threat as data exfiltration from a sensitive repository, you start thinking about data classification, access controls, and detection of unusual access patterns. Threat naming is the foundation of defensible architecture because it turns fear into specific problems you can design against. Once you have a clear threat description, think in terms of attacker paths, because attackers rarely jump straight to the final goal. A path is the sequence of steps an attacker might take, such as getting an initial credential, using it to access a system, escalating privileges, and then reaching sensitive data. Mapping a path helps you decide where controls should go, because controls are most effective when they interrupt the path at multiple points. If you only place one control at the end, you are hoping the attacker reaches the end without being noticed and then gets stopped at the last second. A layered approach tries to slow them down, force them to take riskier steps, and create detectable events earlier. This is a core defense theory idea, and it is exactly what architecture is supposed to enable. Layered controls can be understood as combining prevention, detection, and response support, rather than relying on any single category. Prevention controls reduce the likelihood of success, such as restricting access or hardening a system so an exploit fails. Detection controls increase visibility so that you notice abnormal activity, such as logs, alerts, and anomaly detection. Response support controls make it easier to contain and recover, such as segmentation that limits spread or backups that support restoration. A defensible architecture uses all three because real-world defense is not perfect. If prevention fails, detection should still provide early warning, and response support should still reduce damage. Beginners sometimes assume that prevention is the only real defense and everything else is secondary, but strong programs assume some prevention will fail and plan accordingly. That is a mature mindset because it prepares you for reality instead of for an ideal world. Another important layer concept is that controls should exist at multiple levels, not just at the edge of the environment. If all defenses are concentrated at the perimeter, an attacker who gets inside can move freely. A defensible architecture includes identity controls, network controls, endpoint controls, application controls, and data controls, because attackers can work through any of these layers. Identity is especially important because credentials are a common target and a common attacker tool. If identity is weak, many other controls become easier to bypass. Data controls matter because the ultimate harm often involves sensitive information, and protecting data directly can reduce the impact even if systems are compromised. When you map threats, ask where the threat touches identity, systems, and data, because that reveals where layered controls should be distributed. To make this feel concrete, imagine the threat of unauthorized access through stolen credentials. A defensible architecture might include strong authentication, limited privileges, and monitoring for unusual login behavior, which together create layers. Strong authentication reduces the chance that stolen credentials alone are enough. Limited privileges reduce what a stolen account can do and reduce the blast radius. Monitoring catches unusual access patterns early, such as logins from unusual locations or unusual access attempts. Segmentation and access boundaries can further limit where the attacker can go, even if they have a valid account. Notice how each layer addresses a different part of the path, and how the layers create redundancy. That redundancy is what makes the architecture defensible, because you can explain that the design does not rely on a single lucky stop. Now consider the threat of exploiting an unpatched system, which is another common attacker path. A defensible architecture maps this threat to layers like asset management, patching practices, system hardening, and monitoring for exploit behavior. Asset management matters because you cannot patch what you do not know exists, and unknown systems are often the easiest targets. Patching reduces the likelihood that known vulnerabilities can be exploited. Hardening reduces the impact of exploitation by limiting what an attacker can do even after initial compromise. Monitoring detects unusual process behavior, unusual connections, or changes to system configuration that indicate exploitation. Segmentation can prevent an exploited system from becoming a launch point to reach more critical systems. Again, the mapping shows a story. Know what you have, reduce the openings, limit the damage, and detect quickly. Defensible architecture also requires attention to trade-offs, because every control has costs and side effects. A control might reduce risk but increase friction for users, increase operational complexity, or create new failure modes. That is why mapping is not just matching threat to control, it is matching threat to a control set that fits the organization's needs. If you choose controls that are too heavy, the business may bypass them or the operations team may struggle to maintain them, which reduces real security. If you choose controls that are too light, the architecture remains fragile and incidents become more likely. A manager mindset asks, not only will this control reduce risk, but also can we operate it reliably, and can we measure whether it is working? The best designs are sustainable because sustainability is what keeps defenses effective over time. A common misconception is that more controls automatically means better security, but too many overlapping controls can create complexity that actually makes defense worse. Complexity can hide misconfigurations, cause alert overload, and make it harder for teams to understand what is normal. A defensible architecture aims for purposeful layers, not endless layers. Each control should have a clear role, and controls should reinforce each other rather than duplicate in confusing ways. This is where mapping helps, because it forces you to justify each control by tying it to a threat and to a stage in an attacker path. If you cannot explain what threat a control addresses or how it supports prevention, detection, or response, it may be unnecessary. Removing unnecessary complexity is a security improvement because it increases clarity and reduces opportunities for mistakes. Another key element of defensible design is evidence, meaning you can show that controls are present and functioning. That includes logs that demonstrate monitoring, documentation that demonstrates access boundaries, and metrics that show whether controls are effective. Evidence matters for operations because it supports incident response and continuous improvement, and it matters for governance because leaders and auditors often ask for proof. When you map threats to controls, include the idea of how you will know the control is working. For example, if you rely on monitoring, what events will be logged and reviewed? If you rely on access restrictions, how will you confirm permissions are correct and not drifting over time? A design that cannot be validated is hard to defend because it relies on assumption rather than proof. Defensible architecture also connects strongly to incident response because architecture shapes how easy it is to contain and recover. If systems are segmented and privileges are limited, containment can be targeted rather than disruptive. If logging is consistent, investigations can be faster and more accurate. If backups and recovery processes are built into the design, recovery is more reliable and less chaotic. Beginners sometimes see incident response as separate from architecture, but response is greatly influenced by how systems are built. In exam terms, the best answer often reflects this connection, such as choosing an architectural change that reduces both likelihood and impact rather than choosing a single reactive fix. Mapping threats to layered controls should include response support because resilience is part of defensibility. Finally, designing defensible architecture is about being able to explain your security program as a coherent set of choices. You identify realistic threats, understand attacker paths, and select layered controls that interrupt those paths while balancing usability and operational sustainability. You distribute controls across identity, systems, networks, applications, and data so defense does not collapse when one layer fails. You reduce unnecessary complexity, and you build evidence so you can verify controls and improve them. When you can describe that process, you are not just memorizing security terms. You are demonstrating a management-level understanding of how to build a security posture that can withstand real pressure. That is what defensible architecture means in practice. A design you can justify, operate, measure, and improve because it is grounded in threats and strengthened by layers rather than by hope.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.